I'm joined now by a makeup designer who I think has done just about everything. An awful lot of comedy with Croft and Perry, as well, of course, Doctor Who, but she has really done everything from period to modern day and all the things in between. It's a great delight to introduce Jill Hagger. How are you?
Hi Alex, I'm fine, thanks.
And are you keeping yourself busy during these sort of rather odd times?
Yes, never stop, never stop. Got the family here, so I'm busier than ever. No makeup involved. Well, only my granddaughter's hair, actually. That's quite a challenge. She doesn't sit still.
But I imagine that's nothing new, particularly the early days of the BBC. You must have had all sorts of people to work with, particularly on something like It Ain't Half Hot, Mum, which must have been an early job for you.
It was absolutely spectacular. It was one of the first things I did as a designer. And the only information I was given about the programme from any previous designers was David Croft didn't suffer fools gladly. That was all. Nothing about makeup or wigs or anything. We knew so little about it in those days. So it was a steep learning curve, but I was very fortunate to have my dear friend Shauna with me, who I think you've already interviewed. And there were no prosthetics on that, but she and I got on extremely well and we were a great support for each other. And the boys were just wonderful. We had a ball, really. All the mistakes we made, we learned from fast. Things like not organising sufficient number of extra staff to come and do haircuts or makeup when you've got an entire battalion of soldiers arriving from Aldershot to play the extras, and they were all about 16, and we must have had about 200 of them. So I said to the Shauna and Christy, my other assistant, right, you take a couple of lines each and we just go down, make them all up, put them on. They took their shirts off, got them up to make them all up all the way, and we did it all through lunch and we got them through, but things like that. So we learned quickly. We did learn.
So one of the particular joys of that show is that you had the regulars as officers and soldiers during the day, but they put the shows on at the end of it. So that must have been a great contrast to work on.
Oh, that was huge. I mean, such fun. A lot of research went into that, actually, because one of the main things you find with comedy is that they take it very seriously. And so they did want to look like the film stars that they were representing. And so, your likes of Hedy Lamarr and Betty Grable and all of that. So you were trying to make wigs suit the boys, but look like these women, these stars. And of course, they all loved wearing the eyelashes. I have to say, they all loved dressing up, which did help. But you'd only have, we literally would get a quick change done in 5 minutes per person. They would go to costume. We'd put the hair and makeup on one, and then they'd go to costume, and then the other would have been in costume and came to us, and we did the hair and makeup. Literally got those eyelashes on, full slap, a wig on, 5 minutes per person. I said after that, if you could do comedy, if you could do period comedy, a drama was a doddle, because you would be given an hour to an hour and a half to do that makeup in drama. That was the difference. It was the same with Heidi High. We used to have the stream of extras coming in, 70 odd of them, and you'd have to do all these 50s hairstyles. And I said to the girls, forget this hour that you've had on drama. You have got 5 minutes per person. What? 5 minutes? I said, yes. And most of them didn't believe me, but by the end of it, everybody was so quick, so fast. You just did, because you got the essence of it. You couldn't do quite the detailed job that you would do on drama, but you got the essence that was enough for those sort of things. So yeah, that was all of those. All the Jimmy Perry and David Croft things were terrific learning curves. I mean, the You Rang Me Lord, for instance, was 1920s. But that was like a spoof. So I was expecting, it's a bit like a comic version of it. So everything was over the top. So that again, all the wonderful pin curls and waterways that were really crisp and much stronger. So that when I came to do House of Eliott, there was a sort of a slight feeling that I had to tone all this down to get it a little bit more correct and lived in. But I think that's what took me into House of Eliott, the fact that I knew the 20s very well by then. That's why I was lucky enough to do all sorts of programmes, which is what I've loved across the time, not being pinholed into one type of thing.
That very particular way of working on comedy, did that lead you to deliberately work a lot on that, or was it just sort of how things ended up?
once you became known by a producer or director, you did tend to get asked for. So that was why I tended to do David and Jimmy's a lot. And as such, although they were under the comedy banner, they were all dramas because they were all period programs. And the one thing about David and Jimmy, everything had to be absolutely correct. I mean, again, on Urangulord, Paul and Jeff were sent to butlering school to learn how to hold the trays, do everything, the white gloves, all of that. And they all, all the hairstyles had to be absolutely pristine. I used to cut Jeff's hair every 10 days to keep it absolutely immaculate. And that sort of detail, when it comes from the actors as well and the requirements of the production, it's much easier to keep that whole thing flowing, really, because you've got a precise detail to work to. Something like sometimes on, going back to Doctor Who, when it's a little bit more varied, you don't have a strict criteria to work to, can be more challenging in many ways because you've got to use a lot more imagination sometimes. That's where the Lois Baxter's little wiggly bits on her face, because the team before us had used up the budget for that series. And so Doreen and I had very, very little money to spend. And it was really a way of finding something to make them look a bit different that didn't cost anything. So that's really where that all came from. But then you then had to carry it on through the extras or the supporting artists who were supposed to be part of the peasantry that she was supposed to be part of. So they all had to have them as well, which you don't really notice very much unless you're looking in detail. But there's a lot of stuff like that went on. And I think I was also telling you that the one thing about Leeds Castle was the fact that because we'd run out of money, we had to use the same supporting artists to be the defenders as well as the attackers of the castle. So that was why half of them were wearing helmets all the time, because there's a very limited amount you can do with a moustache or a beard. It doesn't change everybody completely. So and time comes into it, of course.
Because your first encounter with Doctor Who, The Androids of Tara, was almost a historical piece more than anything. So does that push you in a different direction to other programmes? Because I imagine it has to be firmly rooted in some sort of historical period, but you can then play with it.
Well, yes, you can play with it. That's the beauty of something like Doctor Who, because there is no sort of something that has to be, you can't say that it wasn't like that, for instance. But you're led a lot by the costumes, because obviously all the cloaks, and they were playing knights, so hence the beards and that sort of stuff, and the sort of shaped beards. It just gave them a sort of sense of superiority and strength, I suppose. But also a lot comes from the actors themselves. Once they're in the costume, they say, they look a bit, sometimes they can look a bit barefaced if they haven't got anything, because the styles all go together with the costumes. It's the way it goes. It was the same in Ivanhoe when I did that. That was set in 1190. And the first thing the director said to me was, do they all have to have beards? And I said, well, yes, because they didn't have many Bic razors in those days. You can't have all these peasantry all looking clean shaven and immaculate. But he'd obviously seen some programs where he didn't like the beards. And I said, well, give me a chance and let me show you what we can do. And most of those beards were made in about 7 to 9 different pieces, so that they could stick to the face and there was mobility for the actors. A lot of the original beards were all just made in one. So you put them on and they're always pulling away, the glue pulls away, and the actor feels stiff. Whereas by making these, I had 3 pieces under the chin, 3 around the edge there, and then the top pieces joining up, and then the moustache, sometimes in 1, sometimes in 2 pieces, and then the little thumb piece as well. So all of that meant that they moved with the face a lot more and gave the actor a sense of sort of freedom. Yeah, it was quite a challenge, but we got there.
Because that must have been, I imagine, one of your more demanding jobs, because, as you say, everybody has to have something. Ivanhoe had lots of supporting artists, was a lot on location. From your point of view, is that a challenge, or is it a bit of a nightmare?
Well, a bit of both really. It was 19 weeks on the road, so you're planning ahead for all of that, and a lot of the wigs. I managed to get all the fittings done, I think, beforehand. I know one of them on King Ralph. Oh, just got me saying it then. He was the last person to be cast, and normally you would base your courtiers, for instance, or the rest of the team on the main person, because however he looks, it affects the style downwards. But he was the last one to be, Ralph Brown, he was the last one to be cast. And so I literally fitted him for a wig, had his head measured for a wig the day before we were due to start filming. And I remember him saying to me, couldn't I just be bald, because he had quite thinning hair at that time. Could he not just shave it off? I said, well, every other person in this show has got a lot of hair. You know, it was that period, it was long hair and beards. And I said, for the king to be clean shaven and no facial hair, I said, it's just not going to work. So I said, look, let us have this wig made so we've got it. And then when you join us, because he wasn't in for about 6 weeks in, then let's talk about it then. Well, luck would have it that the wig we got and the way the style we'd chosen was exactly the same as his hair had been when he was 18. So he put this wig on, fell in love with it, and wouldn't take it off. So I was very, very lucky there. But those are the sorts of things that you have to persuade people sometimes along the way. Yeah, but you get a style and you decide what it's going to look like. But it was more that everybody really wouldn't have been clean shaven. They would also have been pretty dirty, but because Hollywood HBO were involved, I did get a message from them saying, just tell the makeup girl, eyes and teeth. We don't want any of that rubbish all over their teeth. And I thought, well, these are peasants. They didn't have toothbrushes and toothpaste in those days. So that was a bit more of a challenge, that we couldn't really do anything with their teeth. They were very strict about that. We also had another problem with the blood, because they hadn't decided what time it was going out, and there was always the 9 o'clock watershed, and they weren't sure if it was before 9. They didn't want to show too much blood. Well, this is the time of jousting. You couldn't really have a joust with no blood and everybody attacking each other. We had fights all over. Every castle we went to, there was a fight. I said, well, I can't do this without any blood. This is ridiculous. So I did have to sort of put my foot down a bit there and say, no, look, this is really silly. I can't possibly do that. I mean, there's one of the ones when Kieran Hines gets his eye gouged out in a fight. So I mean, you can't do that without blood. I say, this is ridiculous. So that proved quite a challenge. But and I think there were 55 main artists, all with huge amounts of hair or makeup, depending on what they were playing and that. And all the women obviously all had long hair and that. And then we had, on the big days, the jousting days, we had 450 extras. So that was quite something to organise for too. But it just meant you had a huge team of makeup who came, just get everybody together, and they'd come and arrive and then set up this wonderful tent with everything in it, and then everybody went through. You just managed to get it organised, because nobody walked in off the street looking the way they needed to be. So yeah, it was pretty mammoth. But then I got that programme on the back of doing House of Eliott, and I was the third designer to come to House of Eliott. So again, going back to your original question about are they set, do you have to stick with what they, the style of who they are? And I basically did sort of, when I came to do the programme, said, well, I wasn't that keen to do it really, for a variety of reasons, but at that point. But I said, well, the thing is, though, I would like to be able to change the look, because you had 2 series of them all looking the same, and I don't want to just come and fill somebody else's shoes. So it took a great deal of effort, a great deal of talking on my behalf to get Stella Goni and Louise Lombard to cut their hair, because I had it. They cut it into real 1920s bob, and Stella's hair was shoulder length when we started, when she started the show, and I got it cut. It was lot of persuasion, but I think they were thrilled with it afterwards. And of course they look stunning, absolutely stunning, because it works with all the costumes. And Joan Wad, who did the costumes on that, you know, we did work together well, and with the hats and what would fit and what suited. And so you could make sure the curls came onto the face if that worked with the hat or differently. But I mean, that was just a dream show to do, because it had, for makeup point of view, we had fashion shows, a 1920s fashion show. I mean, how much better can it get for a makeup person?
That is a production that I think is still very well regarded and loved. Was that the start of much sort of bigger, more lavish production starting to come in?
No, I think we'd always done a lot. I mean, one of the early ones I worked on was Poldark. That was as an assistant. I then did the follow-up as a designer, where Ros Ebert, who's costume, and myself, who'd both been assistants on the original Poldark, were hired out to HTV because we had the experience to do this, which was supposed to be the grandchildren of Poldark. It was going to be a follow-up, and they were going to do another series of that, but somehow or other it didn't take off, sadly. But that was wonderful. I mean, I had lovely, lovely actors in it. Ewan Griffiths, who's now a big name in Hollywood. I remember saying to him at the time, "You'll go to Hollywood, I can feel it." He said, "Oh, don't be so silly, Jill. Don't be so." I mean, I think he was about 19 or 20 at the time. I said, "Yes, he just oozed ability. He was just wonderful." And there were a lot of them in that show that did that. So, as I say, Ros and I did it because we'd worked on the original one. We were the only ones that really knew the full story. I don't think any of the rest of the production had actually read all of the original. And every now and again, they'd talk about some character would begin, "Oh, you couldn't possibly do that. They had a feud with the Poldarks years ago. They wouldn't be talking to them. You couldn't possibly." Things like that. So I think but the people doing one thing after another. We did big stuff. So say there was the Explorers. I think it was because colour was coming in, and it just expanded everything. And after the Palaces, which had been, you know, that was really huge. I worked on that as an assistant too. So you just did anything and everything that was going. It was just amazing. And the plays for today's and play of the months. It was always wonderful things. I did Huis Clos. I did that with Omar Sharif and Jean Moreau. That was something else too. They were hysterical because they came from France, and they assumed that you finished filming at 6 o'clock, and they in the makeup room, and they were chatting away as we were making them up, and they were talking about where they were going for dinner that night. And I thought, "Ooh, I don't think they know that we go until 10 o'clock. So I quietly went to the production manager and said, "Just to let you know, they think they're going out for dinner and they're planning where to go." "What? Can't possibly." So they had to go and have a quiet word with them. And they were in such a foul mood that evening, because they had no idea. In France, you stop for dinner. End of story. But not in England. We worked till 10 o'clock at night. So, but I had all my continuity pictures of Omar Sharif stolen from my makeup place that time. I was so upset because he had been my heartthrob when I'd been a teenager. So I was so excited to work with him. And I never got any pictures left. So that was a shame. But yeah. So
BBC must have been a fantastic place, say, to work with some incredible actors. But who were the people you particularly learned from then as you went through?
Well, as I said right from the beginning, any of the designers that you, as a trainee and as an assistant, you worked with the big name designers, and they were all doing incredible stuff. So you were lucky as to who you got to work with. And I actually did something with Mary Tam before the Doctor Who, which one was she in?
And Joyce of Tara.
It was Girls of Slender Means, and I did that with Liz Moss, was my designer on that, and she had quite a reputation as being very, very strict to work with. And I remember the first thing, so we did this Girls of Slender Means. It had Patricia Hodge, Miriam Margolyes. I mean, it was a cast that they all went on to do wonderful things. And I was looking after Miriam Margolyes, and Liz sort of threw me this piece of hair and said, "Now, Marcel wave that." Well, Marcel waving is done with metal tongs, and it's quite tricky. It was something they did in the 1920s. And I looked at it, I said, I'm not sure I'm very good at that. She said, well, you will be by the end of it. And that was it. And I used to have to tong this whole piece. And she was absolutely right. By the end of the week, I was dab hand at it, which stood me in marvellous stead for going on to do House of Eliott, because it was all done with tongs. So things like that, you learned from the designs, but it was a lot of luck as to the programs that you went on as to what they were doing. Again, if I go back to, I suppose, things like Pole Dark, we'd have big ball scenes. You'd have, you had to do things very, very fast. I mean, actually, I go back to black and white minstrel shows. That was another thing I trained on. And again, we had dancers. A friend of mine, Viv, and I were trainees together on it, and they used to give us one dancer to start with, and then they obviously decided we could cope, so we got 2 dancers each to cope with, and that meant that dancers had to, and it was all live then, so quick changes meant that they just didn't stop, and these girls were incredibly good at doing this. And you go again, which is I suppose where I learned for Ain't Half Hot, you sent one to costume and you did one's hair and then they swapped over, but you'd be putting their hair up and putting huge pieces on the hair and feathers in and goodness knows what, because they were all doing the high kicks and that type of dancing. Well, I mean, you know, you could, if you got to do that in 3 minutes, it's amazing. So, and you just had to do it. There was no, it didn't work. You just had to. So I suppose all the way you're learning, plus visual effects. That was another one. When I did Star Cops, there was one particular episode in it, I remember, where the crew of a spaceship it had all gone missing, and they found them. They were all desiccated bodies, basically. So we had 9 or 10 of these bodies. So visual effects were obviously supplying the bodies, and they were dressed in whatever clothing. I was expected to do the hair and the face, and I said, God, I've never worked on a gelatine body, you know, or anything. So I used to go off to visual effects workshop, and I've got a feeling, I'm not sure it's Dave Harbour, I can't remember who it was now. I've worked with so many of them over the time. Anyway, he was airbrushing the bodies, and he showed me how to do it on the faces. I said, this is the way to go for makeup. Absolutely fantastic. So I used to have a go. I was doing that. I was sticking hair on them, mainly what I was doing, but then I had to make their faces because they were all skeletal and that. So, and he showed me how to use it. It was absolutely wonderful fun. And I so kicked myself for not following it up to go into proper cosmetics, because basically it did take off. But I used that. I used it when we went to New Zealand to do Lost World. We had supposed to be a tribe of Indians. Lost World was like the original Jurassic Park. It's the real story of Conan Doyle's Lost World. Challenger sort of gets lost in this place that's got dinosaurs in it, which again is where I managed to go with Shauna. And you say about where do you learn? We knew that there would be some prosthetics on it, but we didn't get to do it because, unfortunately, you know, by then the budgets were changing and there was a lot more prosthesis going on out in the film world. So there were companies growing up, and of course, from a director's point of view, they wanted to expand their knowledge and that. So we had these lovely guys come and do it, and I can remember standing there and they were talking about, oh, well, they could do all this with their CGI stuff. They were going to do these dinosaur wounds, and I was listening to this and I thought, hang on a minute, this is our department, you know, you can't muscle in here. But I thought, can't go. So I remember saying, oh, and how much will that cost? Oh, well, you know, and they were talking hundreds of thousands of pounds. So I said to the director in front of me, I said, why don't you let us just have a go at it? And then if you don't like it, they can still do it afterwards, can't they? But if it's any good, you won't have to bother. So that's what we did. So I sent Shauna off. Shauna, right, dinosaur wounds. I mean, the joy of that was, of course, is absolutely nobody knows what a dinosaur wound looks like. So we had free reign. So, and they kept ours in. So that was when the whole CGI stuff started to come in. I felt that that's when we were on dangerous ground. But, you know, we kept our heads above water, I think, in that, because actors do like to be looked after, and there's that intimacy that comes with getting to know them and working with them, and they like to have an input into what they look like and how they're going to play it. And that's where the choice of their hairstyles and it's something that comes from all of you put together, unless there's a particular style that they just have to go with.
So when you first get a script, and where do you start the process? Do you start talking to the costume designer? Do you do your own research? Do you speak to the actor? Where does it begin, or does it vary from show to show?
Well, I'd say it probably varies from show to show. On the whole, you would have spoken to the director before you get the script, and you speak to them and you find out what ideas they've got. Sometimes they can be very, very, very strict on what they want it to be like. Others say, well, no, as long as it doesn't look modern, then it'll be period. That can be a bit frustrating, because then they're not really sure on the intricacies of a period hairstyle and how long it might take or something like that. And then the actor or actress comes along, and they've obviously got a strong idea of what they want to look like. And then you can be either restricted by the costumes or helped by, you sort of have to work with them. So it's a general thing. I mean, again, I did The Rivals, which was a huge production, which had all the extras. We had about 70 or 80 sporting artists, and they all had to have false noses. They were all either short and fat or tall and thin. So we had to make all these noses to echo whatever that was. So the wigs also, if they had a long pointy nose, they had a tall wig. And I can remember talking to dear Colin Lavers, and I said, look, I've got this long hat. And he made me a little hat, literally a little hat, to sit on the top of this huge hairstyle and things like that. So, there were a lot of occasions when we would work very closely together with them. And again, that was another one of those. We had literally 45 minutes per person to do a false nose, white face, pock marks, and this huge wigs. And the girls, the team got it down to 45 minutes. But I mean, it was a record. It was unbelievable. And we had to do them. We started at 4:30 in the morning to get them on set for 11, because the number we had to get through. I remember doing that. That was quite a mammoth, quite a mammoth show. But fabulous. I mean, again, wonderful name people, Sheila Hancock and Donald Sinden, and names that I just feel so lucky to have ever worked with all these people in various ways. Because a lot of the time you then Diana Sheridan, for instance, who was in Doctor Who with me, she came and she was in the comedy series that we did with, which is also with Donald Sinden. Is it Don't Tell Father or something like that? Nigel Havers, I can't remember the name of it now. This is the trouble. They but you get to know them as friends. That's what's so lovely. So again, they feel more comfortable with you. You can't do that with CGI.
So it's something like Peter Davison's Doctor Who's that you did two of. Was that a little bit more straightforward then? Because it wasn't lots of essays. It was sort of fairly, I imagine, straightforward hairstyles, was it?
Yes, it was. Well, the Doctors on the whole, I mean, they were set in stone and you didn't really do anything to them, trim them a bit occasionally and that, but they were great fun to work with, all of them. And I think they loved coming together as the 5 Doctors. I think it was an experience for them. I mean, Patrick Troughton was getting a little bit elderly by then, so, but he was so sweet, such a lovely man. And all of them, yeah, they were great fun. John Poe is just full of beans all the time, absolutely wonderful. Tom, of course, wasn't actually there, as I think is probably well documented by now. And Peter just bounced along all the time. And Liz Sladen, I got to know quite well over that series. I actually co-wrote a book with her about makeup, which was extraordinary. Yes, it was busy over numbers of people that you had to get out, and they all had their own requirements, but the Doctors themselves were fairly, there wasn't a huge amount required on them other than the odd hair trim and that. The main thing I do remember on that was the Cybermen, because they're all in their gear, so you think, oh, don't need makeup and all of that. But there was one particular bit of it where, I can't actually remember, I just remember that you could see inside their mouths, you could see the actor inside, because of the way they were shooting it. So I had to get them eating with blackjack sweets so that it would make their teeth and their tongue go black, so you couldn't see it inside their mouths. So, makeup can take all forms. Carrying a bag of sweets around. Yeah, so.
And something like Frontios that is set in the future on an alien planet. How do you sort of give that a time period? Because looking at it now, particularly someone like Leslie Dunlop, that's a very sort of 80s look. Do you deliberately set it in present day because, of course, then you've got that shorthand of it's not period? How do you approach something like that?
Well, I think again that probably comes from the production. If they don't want anything to look too otherworldly, if they want it to look a bit more realistic, then that's what you have to go with. It's not really up to me to say, no, they must look like this or they must look like that. And of course, most of them are in those uniform type things. So to do something rather strange with their hair or facial hair would look a bit odd. It just wouldn't quite go with it. Also, of course, they're all sort of going through all sorts of tunnels and God knows what. So to do anything that's a bit over the top or requires too much time and effort to look after restricts the production, because you're constantly going, oh no, I've got to put a pin in or redo this or whatever. And they don't want that. They just want to be able to get on with the show. So sometimes it's down to that, the time strictures on it, and they just haven't got time to wait for you. So and maybe that sort of wasn't their choice at that time, but yes, from that point of view, it wasn't a heavy-sided makeup one. That one.
Whereas I imagine something like the Dick Emery show, that was lots of sketches. That must have been a great one to do. But would you have been given a lot of prep time to develop each character?
Well, again, when I took it on, several of the characters were already set in stone, like Hetty and Loverboy and all that sort of stuff. So you just took those on and either needed new wigs made, because they did take quite a hammering with the amount of setting and that they had. But new characters were always more interesting. I did a couple of sort of films with him when he was sort of branching out, trying not to just do sketches, which were the standard characters. But one where he was playing sort of 5 different characters within the film. Now, those are much more interesting because Dick, again, was, as I said to you earlier, comedy is taken very seriously, and he was very particular about everything. And because a lot of the time he's talking to himself, so he always had a double to play the other part, where he would not let you use his wigs for the double. So I had to have 2 of everything. And so you were constantly changing whichever. So that sort of thing. So that's quite busy and quite heavy. But again, he's got quite an input, but because he knew how he was going to play them and what he wanted. But he did allow a lot, and I would sort of be able to create the shape and the style, and then he would gradually mould into it. We'd make it together. There was one when we went to, we were filming in Tunisia, and I know for that character, his first thought was that he wanted to have a bald cap and just have sort of like 3 strands of hair over the top. And I can remember to this day thinking, oh my God, we're going to the desert. The thought of a bald cap in that heat, not only me trying to put it on, but it staying on in that heat and him sweating. So I did have to do a lot of persuasion that this wasn't very practical and that it would take a long time to put it on and take it off. He would get very hot and uncomfortable, and the production probably wouldn't want to wait for me to constantly be redoing it, and then you've got this edge and that. So we did manage to steer away from that. But he was great fun to work for. I really enjoyed my time with him. He was, he was a very gentle man, and as I say, such a stickler. There was one when I did make him up with a bald cap, and he sat there and he fell asleep. And he was always very careful about his hair. It always had to be pristine and washed and that. And so I put this bald cap on, stuck it on. He'd fallen asleep while I was doing it. And so I sort of carried on, did it all, gently nudged him and said, done, you're finished now. Oh, okay. And he got up and walked off. And I thought, he's going to go to his dressing room, forgetting that he's even got this on, and have 50 fits that he's suddenly gone bald, which he did a bit. He was a bit surprised. But he was lovely because he just trusted me to do it. And so you just did. I think he was playing, yes, I think that was when he was doing a thing from The King and I think that was that for that one. So, yeah, it was fun. Yes.
Well, we've talked about comedy greats, fantastic peer productions, and I think we could talk all day and more about your work. But I'd just like to say thank you very much for your time, Jill. It's been an absolute delight to touch upon some of the jobs you've done.
Well, thank you, Alex. It's lovely to go down memory lane. It just makes me feel even older than I am. Thank you very much.